Good morning and welcome to Personalized Learning Plans in Vermont. This is Erin Maguire. I am the Director of Student Support Services for Chittenden Central Supervisory Union. This webinar is sponsored by Vermont Family Network, and I just wanted to take a moment to express appreciation for the work that VFN does both with families, students, and schools. We have lots of great examples of collaboration, and I'm grateful to be able to provide this webinar on their behalf. The topic of this webinar offers us an opportunity to really talk about the exciting times that we're in right now in education, and I'd like to give a little bit of my own background so you know where I come from and why I'm so excited about this particular topic. So I have served in the education system in Vermont for about 17 years. I've served as a paraeducator. I have served as a middle school science teacher. I've also been a special educator, and then for much of my career I've been an administrator and educational leader in the area of special education, as well as considering 504 and educational support systems. I've also done a good amount of work with school counseling and nursing supports. I am particularly interested in personalized learning for a number of different reasons. My perspective around education is one of making sure that all students and children in our system get what they need, and in order to do so, that means that sometimes we need to do things differently for different students. This offers an opportunity for Vermont students to experience truly individualized ownership around their educational experiences, and so I'm grateful to be able to talk with you about that today. The source of personalized learning plans actually came from the legislature in Act 77. We're going to talk a little bit about that today, but just before I get too far into the conversation with you all today, just wanted to make sure to reiterate that I appreciate questions and also make sure that if I use jargon of any kind that you speak up about that. I live, breathe, eat, and sleep education, and there are lots of acronyms, as all of you are well aware, and so it's important that if I use a term or I use some letters that you don't know what they mean, that you're probably not alone in that, and that you should go ahead and speak up through the question box. So with that, why don't we get started? I wanted to talk a little bit today about the purpose of this conversation. We really want to make sure that out of this dialogue today, you come out with an understanding of what personalized learning plans are, both the purpose of them in education as well as the logistics. What do they look like and how do they work? I also would like to make sure that you have an understanding of the relationship as it is presently understood around special education and personalized learning plans, 504 plans, as well as educational support systems and EST plans as they interrelate and interweave with PLPs. I am going to start using the term PLP, and that means personalized learning plans. You'll see that throughout the presentation. So the first thing we're going to do today is talk about the role of student-centered learning and personalization. We'll then move into a little bit of conversation around definitions and structures, things you need to know about the present state of being, if you will, of the progress in education in Vermont today, because personalized learning plans are one part of some new work that's happening in our educational systems. And it all interrelates, and so it'll be important for you to have that context. We will do some logistical review of what is a personalized learning plan, what do they look like, where are schools with their implementation. We will then move into the relationship between special education and PLPs as well as 504 and ESTs. Again, I encourage questions, and we'll have a time at the end for questions. And then I have a series of resources that I would like to provide. It's my understanding that this PowerPoint presentation will be available following this this presentation, following the webinar, and so I would encourage you to locate that. There will be some links in the presentation that will be valuable. So with that, what I'd like to do is encourage everyone to think about what they were hoping to get out of this webinar, one thing that you were really hoping that you came away with today. And what I'd like you to do is go ahead and put that into the question box, because while I've presented many times on many topics, what I know is that every audience is different, and it's really important to me that you have your questions answered, or you get out of today what you were really hoping to come away with. Hopefully many of the questions will be addressed through the presentation already, but I am happy to address other topics that weren't necessarily part of the presentation. So please take a moment and go ahead and put in what you were hoping to get out of today into the question box and hit send so that I can see that. I'm going to give you just a moment to do that. Okay, why don't we go ahead and jump in. The first piece of this conversation is specific to the concept of personalization. And a gentleman named Ken Robinson, who is very well respected internationally around education, said that the answer is not to standardize education, but to personalize and customize it to the needs of each child and community. And that has always been something that he has been a strong proponent of. That has a long history in Vermont as well in many different ways, but for the first time we have a very specific way that we are expected now to personalize for individual students. I am going to now send to you a link through the chat box, which only I will use, but I'm going to go ahead and send it to you, because what I'd like to do is have you watch a YouTube video on student-centered learning that's been developed by the Nellie May Foundation. And I want to give you some specific directions about this because I cannot show the video through the actual webinar platform. So I'm going to do two things, and you have a choice. You can either click on that link and go watch that video. It's about 3 minutes and 40 seconds, or you can actually just listen to the video through this webinar presentation. I'm going to go ahead and play that to here. You won't be able to see the video, but you'll be able to hear the video, and the importance is in the words that are shared. But if you would prefer to be able to also see the pictures with it, you may go ahead and click that link to be able to watch the actual video in a different window.
A chalkboard, a desk, the homework, the books. The day begins and ends when the bells ring. For centuries now, this has defined what all of us think about school. We have come to believe that this is the one way that students will learn. And with that belief, we have taught all of our students in pretty much the exact same way. But the world has changed, and what it means to be ready to succeed in the future has also changed. That means our model of learning must change. It's happening now, and it needs to happen even more. In more places, for all students, especially for those for whom the current system isn't working. There is strong data that shows we need to rethink learning. Like remodeling a house, we're not just adding a new coat of paint, we're updating the outdated parts and making it more modern and efficient, strengthening what works and fixing what doesn't. Gone are the days when some students can excel and others just get by. Our society needs all kids to excel at high levels, and to make this happen, we need to engage our students like never before. This is student-centered learning. It incorporates a student's skills and interests into the learning process, making the experience more personalized and involving the student in his or her own future. What makes this work? There are 4 key principles of student-centered learning. Number 1, learning is personalized. Personalized learning happens when teachers know students, have strong relationships with them, and can meet students where they are in their development. Number 2, learning is competency-based. Learning is about the information and skills a student has mastered, not just moving through a curriculum. In a competency-based system, students can proceed at their own pace in every subject, enabling teachers to respond to individual needs, interests, and challenges. Number 3, learning happens anytime, anywhere. Students will often make important discoveries about themselves and the world around them when they learn beyond the traditional school day and outside the traditional school walls. Learning doesn't start and stop when the bells ring. And number 4, the last key to student-centered learning is students take ownership. Don't make a decision about students without students. They play a direct role in their own success, actively engaging with the process to ensure the impact is lasting and meaningful. For student-centered learning to work, all 4 of these principles must work together. This is not an a la carte approach. It's reimagining education so it works for all students. The fact is, our world is changing. And with the latest in child development research, we know better than ever before how children and young adults learn. The facts are there, and they point to the need for a new system of learning designed around each student. And when the student becomes stronger and more focused, all of us will benefit from a new generation that is contributing to our communities and our world in so many ways. This is student-centered learning.
I hope those of you who stayed on the webinar could hear that just fine, and I am going to give just one more moment for those who left the webinar to go listen to the video to return. Okay, so I played that video or that audio for you because I think it's important to think about personalization in the larger context of education. As we think about personalization and we start to think about the 21st century, we know that much of our world is very personalized now. All of our phones are very individualized to us by the apps we put on them or the types of apps we choose, and we also experience that on a regular basis when we think about how we interact with our world. There are pros and cons to that because sometimes we need to be part of a collective and not everything can be exactly as we need it for ourselves at all times. But when we think about learning and we think about personalization, what strikes me is that in order to make sure students have ownership and students are motivated to learn, that they need to be able to have their entry point and their learning progression be specified to them so that they're not frustrated or they're not under challenged, and they're able to have their needs met and be able to also self-reflect. So the personalization piece is really critical in order to maximize the amount of growth that students receive during their educational experience. There are a couple of pieces that I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about them in the context of some definitions and structures, what you need to know about the role of PLPs in the larger system. So some of you may have heard of multi-tiered system of supports. This is a framework that Vermont has certainly taken pieces of from the national level, but has designed a Vermont framework for MTSS, or multi-tiered system of supports. And it incorporates a really important set of standards for schools as we think about the work that we're doing. It specifically talks about making sure that schools have a systemic approach, that we have systems in place that will address the needs of students, because if you try to only build systems that are student by student by student, it becomes challenging, but that we have a systemic approach, that we have effective collaboration in schools, that we have high quality first instruction in the classroom, and that we also have high quality intervention Also that we have a comprehensive and balanced assessment system, so the local assessments, the assessments that teachers give to students during their time in the classroom are high quality and valuable, and that we have well-designed professional development. So those are the 5 components of MTSS, and they play an important role because PLPs are a part of the larger system, and many school districts and the state are using MTSS as a framework for thinking on a large scale about educational systems and school systems in our state. Another component that is important as you think about PLPs and is very interrelated is the proficiency-based graduation requirements that will be required for all students to graduate from high school in 2020. And proficiency-based graduation requirements changes our thinking in high schools from credits into being able to perform proficiencies for purposes of graduation requirements, and it is related to proficiency-based learning, which is a framework of thinking about how students are instructed, assessed, and graded, and how they self-reflect on their performance differently than getting a 100 or an 89, but thinking about what standard is it that I'm looking to perform, how am I going to perform it, and being able to show that performance to teachers and then having teachers provide feedback around that. That becomes particularly important later as we talk about the structures of personalized learning plans, because personalized learning plans frame themselves around student goals and performance versus getting an A in a class or getting credit for getting an A in a class. We're really starting to change the way we think about student learning to a much more performance and proficiency-based framework. Many of you have probably heard of differentiation and differentiated instruction. Differentiated instruction is something that has been in Vermont for quite some time, and there's been a good deal of research around it. It is a framework or philosophy for teaching that involves providing different students with different avenues to learning in terms of acquiring the content, how they process information, how they construct or make meaning of ideas, and trying to make sure that there are different avenues. So that's something that we'll talk a little bit about today. I also wanted to note that universal design for learning, and if you ever want to learn more about this topic, you should definitely visit the CAST, C-A-S-T website. But universal design for learning is a framework for improving and optimizing teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how the brain works. And so what that means is that teaching and learning takes place through multiple avenues, and there are multiple ways to perform inside of a proficiency-based learning system. I'm providing you this information again because I think it's important to understand all of the pieces that need to exist for PLPs to be really successful. Multiple pathways or flexible pathways is another really critical component both of Act 77, which is the law that brought PLPs to Vermont, as well as the flexible pathways. They are interrelated in that law because flexible pathways basically provides an expectation of multiple opportunities for students to be able to reach their goals, that there's not one pathway to reach a goal that you may have or to reach the ability to show proficiency on a particular graduation requirement, but that we really need to think flexibly and think about multiple pathways for students to be able to get there. I also included the word standards on this slide because the Common Core state standards are the standards for Vermont, and they drive a lot of the work here underneath. And so when we think, for example, about proficiency-based graduation requirements, which will show up in a PLP, and again, I'll go through that in a little bit, are all based on the Common Core state standards. And so all of these pieces are important to understand as we begin to talk through PLPs and what they are. So let's get right into what is a PLP. So as we, hold on, sorry, there we go. So as we think about personalized learning plans, there is a clear definition of what a personalized learning plan is, and I'm going to walk you through that because in order for me to discuss the interaction of special education and outside service providers with PLPs, I need to make sure that you understand what they are. They really are about documentation of an evolving plan that's developed on behalf of students. It's an ongoing and iterative process, and it involves the student and a representative from the school, and then if the student is a minor, also the student's parent or legal guardian, and needs to be updated annually. The plan must be developmentally appropriate based on the student and needs to reflect emerging abilities, aptitudes, and dispositions. And then the plan also needs to define the scope and rigor of the academic opportunities for the student to complete secondary school successfully and attain a post-secondary readiness to be ready to engage in civic life. You know, there are a couple of really important pieces that I want to note on this slide. One is that this really is a national movement, and while Vermont has moved into the requirements for PLPs to be in place, there are many states around the nation doing this, and so that means that there are lots of resources out there, which is really helpful. It is also important to note that PLPs will help us form a base for progress because we grow from where a student is. No matter who that student is and where they enter, that's where they grow from. And so PLPs really offer an opportunity to think about students where they are as a whole student. It's not divided by this part of a student or that part of a student. It's not about disability. It's not about giftedness. It really just is about that individual student as a whole student and where they find themselves. And the PLPs also allow us to have a system in place to make sure that's in place for all students. Some of you may have heard this idea, I know I have, over the last, I don't know, probably 15 years. One day all students will have an IEP. And I think you know, that concept has to some degree become a reality in the piece of planning for every student. But it is very different than an IEP, and it actually is a plan that I think will show up as a system of personalization that will help define where we go educationally for all kids, which is very, very exciting for me. Because inclusion, and as we think about inclusion, thinking about all kids together is really critical, and this really allows us to do that, which is very exciting. The next thing I'm going to talk about are the structures that exist for personalized learning plans. PLPs are on the upswing. I would not describe PLPs as fully implemented yet. They're not in that place under the law, and I don't think that they're in that place in many schools. They are in the design process, and when that is happening and we are flying the plane and building it at the same time, it means that there will be new tools that are coming out, and that certainly is the case for PLPs. So I wanted to let you know that there are several options. If you have a student who has a PLP, you will likely experience one of these options, but maybe others that I don't necessarily know about. There are different softwares that we're using to do the actual plan writing. One of them is called Naviance. That's a high school and middle school software that allows for planning both for college readiness and career readiness, and has a PLP system designed into it. Some schools are using Google Sites in order to have students develop their PLPs. Those are designed on an actual website that is available to the student, where they can upload portfolios and all kinds of goals that they may have that is iterative over time. There's a new software out there called Lift that was designed by a group of teachers at Mount Abraham, and that program is not one I have a lot of experience with, but it looks pretty darn cool, and I am excited to see what other options will be coming out. As students engage with PLPs, it is likely that they will be using technology to develop their PLP and store their PLP and interact with their PLP. Their schools will be doing the same. So that's just a structure for PLPs to be aware of. The relationships with students in reference to PLPs is very important, and so there will be school-specific structures where the person who develops a personalized learning plan with a student will be someone from the school that should have relationship with the student to be able to help them do the design work in reference to their PLP. This might take place in an advisory. It might take place in homeroom. It might take place as part of an English or reading class or a math class or some other structure that a school chooses to implement the writing, development, and following of PLPs. The state right now is really recommending that special educators are not the primary person for PLP development for students with disabilities, but rather that special educators, if they have, for example, a homeroom, that they do PLP development with their homeroom, with all students in their homeroom. We really want to make sure that everyone is aware that this is a general education initiative in Vermont schools, and it is about all students, and if we want this to work well, we need to make sure that the practices that we have around its implementation shows that, and that means that the structures and the relationships that are designed to develop PLPs and follow them over a student's secondary career, that we don't sort of segregate that out into different service sets, but instead make it a holistic process. That does not mean that a special educator might not work with a student or have some input or interact with the PLP process. It just means that students with disabilities should be treated as all other students are around PLP design. It's worth noting that PLPs are required only at specific grade levels, and I'm going to talk with you in a moment about the implementation of PLPs in Vermont and when to expect them and why to expect them in certain grades. But right now, K-6 is not included in the PLP. Grades kindergarten through 6th grade are not included in that process. However, there are many schools who are choosing to do a much wider implementation other than what is required by law for PLPs, and you may experience, depending on in what school you're in, students developing PLPs at much earlier grades than 7th grade, and some schools that I know of are actually moving forward with K all the way through 12. It's important to recognize that the conversation about multiple and flexible pathways to learning are a part of this conversation. We want students to have access to many different ways of reaching their goals, and in the same way that you might think about a roadmap, so might you think about the flexible pathways that exist. If I am driving from Williston to Rutland, there are several ways that I can get there. I do not have to take Route 7. I can I can go down 116. And so in the same way, and not to oversimplify it, so should students' pathways to their goals be flexible, and they need to be personalized, and that is part of the PLP process. Part of the reason that is such an important component of PLPs is that students need to have ownership, and so we really need to think carefully about how to build ownership for students in these processes. We don't want to be telling students, here's how this should go. We really want to walk through a process that elicits what's important to that student, what course offerings are they interested in, what relationships are valuable for them, and asking ourselves, how is it that we can help students advocate for themselves rather than deciding their pathway. So that's another really important piece. Course offerings in high school are variable across this state. There are some high schools that are small high schools and may not be able to necessarily offer a whole variety of different kinds of courses, and so thinking about building different ways of experiencing coursework and learning in a high school setting might be different. For example, at Essex High School, which is the high school that is within my supervisory union, versus Rochester, Vermont, which is actually where I grew up. And so that is a very different framing on how to think about course offerings. But course offerings shape but do not constrain personalized learning plans. We really are working to figure out flexibility, and in these first years of implementation of personalized learning plans, it's really starting to push the envelope around understanding, wow, you know, we have a number of students who have this particular goal or this particular interest, and we don't have a lot of offerings that will address that. And so how can we be creative? In the law, there's actually a series of suggested creative opportunities that we need to create. They include things like internship, and there's the ability to go to early college as a senior now in Vermont, dual enrollment in college courses, and thinking about independent studies. Our tech centers in Vermont offer amazing opportunities and that really can identify with students' PLPs, but one of the things that I always encourage people to think about as they consider PLPs is to make sure that we're not closing the door on interest simply because there's not a class called that. And what is it that we can do to really expand the way we think about student learning, especially in the middle and a high school setting where sometimes we think about, oh, we're going to take English 10, and that has a particular frame around it. But how do we get out of the boxes of Carnegie units and really start to think about proficiencies and flexible pathways? I wanted to show you the PLP template. I'm struck by maybe I should put this into the chat box, which I can. If somebody wants me to do that, please go ahead and put that in your question box. But I wanted to make sure that you had access to a sample template of a PLP. The Agency of Education has been kind enough to go ahead and develop a template. They did that with a group of stakeholders. And if you go to that sample template, what you'll see is that there are a number of pieces that begin to lead us into the conversation about the comparison between IEPs and PLPs. I am being asked to go ahead and put this into the chat window, and so what I'm going to do is escape out of this just for one moment, and you'll be able to see me do this, and then I'm going to put this into the chat box in just a moment so that you can see that, and you can go ahead and click on the template, and then I'm going to talk about it for just a minute. All right, let's see, did that work? There you go. So hopefully that will give you access to the template. I'm going to go ahead and now re-enter into my slideshow. There we go. So what I wanted to talk about briefly was the template itself, and I'm going to walk you through it, and I'll walk you through it auditorily, and then you can also go ahead and take a look at the sample template at your leisure. The student information at the top of the template provides the name and the date of the plan development, the people who participated. Also, one of the important components of a PLP is the graduation date, and so the anticipated graduation date is something that many of you will recognize also from the transition planning process, which I'll talk about in a little bit. There's a student profile section. It's really important that students over time develop a sense of self, and given that this is primarily, many of you may be parents listening to this, I'm a parent as well, it's very important that we help our children build a sense of self and understand how to self-reflect, because one of the components of PLPs is the ability for children to be able to have their own thoughts about who they are, where they're going, and what their goals are, what their interests are, and their skills and strengths. And then also, what are their core values and principles, what's important to them. So that's all part of this template. It also talks about assessments that they've taken, and so that will be important for thinking about interest inventories, assessment of skills, learning inventories that they've taken. And again, self-reflection is key in this process, and so that's something that we should be thinking about. The template then goes into individual student goal setting. What are the personal goals for the student? What do they need to achieve their goals, and both short-term and long-term? And how do I know if I'm meeting those goals? So thinking about that self-reflection, we think about after high school as well as during high school, and how do I know that I'm meeting those steps as you develop goals and then walk along them. There's then the learning expectations that are interrelated to the goals as part of the template, and it helps students understand what are the common expectations at my school for learning, what is the academic plan based on, and then how does the student know that they have achieved the plan. And so that's really about making a pathway. There's a section for transition, so again, that interrelationship with the transition plan and the IEP is going to be really important. There's a self-reflection component, and then there's also a place in the template for parent and guardian reflection, which is important. And parents play a very important role in the PLP because they can provide thoughts and feedback to students. What's really important is that, again, we help students self-develop the skills to be able to participate in the PLP process. Again, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So before I get specifically into the section where we begin to discuss the interrelationship between special education, 504 NEST, and PLPs, just wanted to give you an overview of the expected implementation of PLPs. So schools are expected to implement PLPs based on the required timelines in the law in Act 77, and the Agency of Education has provided guidance to schools about implementation, for example, that template I just talked about, but schools do have some flexibility in regard to the systems and structures that they can implement as they go forward. For example, as I discussed, they can go ahead and use Naviance, or they can use Google Docs to be able to document the PLPs. The template is a suggested template. It's not a required template, and so it doesn't have to have every single piece of it, of that template in there. However, there is a very specific date range and implementation plan for which grades get PLPs when. So ultimately, the goal is that students 7th through 12th grade have PLPs, all of them. But in order to make the implementation process go more smoothly and make sure schools had capacity to do this body of work, we went ahead and said, okay, so the first grades that are going to write PLPs, and that was this past school year, were grades 7th and 9th, and then also any 11th or 12th graders who are dually enrolled students in college courses. So that was this past year. And you'll remember that there is just one moment, we're having a little technical piece. So remember that the PLPs, as I describe them in the definition, need to be reviewed annually. And so in 2016, what will happen is that grades 7 and 9 will develop plans for the first time, but the plans for grades 8 and 10, which were developed last year when they were 7th and 9th graders, will be annually reviewed. And then that requirement of 11th and 12th graders who are dually enrolled must have PLPs as well still. So that's another requirement. And then the following year out, what we will see is 7th graders will develop plans for the first time, but the 8th graders, the 9th graders, the 10th graders, and 11th graders will annually review their PLPs that were designed through the other implementation processes the prior 2 years. And then 12th graders who are dually enrolled. And then by 2018, all students in grades 7 through 12 will have PLPs. So that is the expected timeline. That becomes particularly important as we begin to discuss the interrelationship between support services, special education, and PLPs, because all students who have IEPs and are eligible for special education or 504 plans by 2018 will have PLPs, but in the meantime, as we go through this implementation phase, not all of them will, and they will move through their experience and will get PLPs on an ongoing basis. Which brings me to piece of advice number 1, as you are experiencing IEP meetings and the education for your child or children with whom you work, it's important to ask the question, is this a year that the student will develop a PLP? And that's important for all folks to ask, because some schools are implementing faster than this timeline. The timeline that's on your screen right now is what's required, and some schools are doing it faster. And so it's worthwhile just saying, when is the PLP going to be developed, and what's the software that it's going to, that we're going to use, and what's the role of the parent in that process, and how will that happen? So that's always a good question to ask given the implementation of PLPs. Let's start talking now about PLPs in special education. So PLPs and IEPs, Individualized Education Programs, need to work together. They do not replace each other, they supplement each other. There are some similarities between IEPs and IEPs in that the strengths and interests and preferences and secondary goals are a strong part of the special education process under IDEA, and they are also a strong part of the PLP process. And so those components of an IEP and a PLP may be similar. There may be some disability-specific information that's necessary in an IEP that you wouldn't see in a PLP. However, you will see some overlap because strengths and interests are critical to both documents. It's also important to note that the availability of multiple pathways and increasing options in schools may impact what's necessary in an IEP. So remember that IEPs are a document that assures a free, appropriate public education. And that means that the services and accommodations that are necessary for students and children to gain reasonable educational benefit from their access to their education are in place given the disability that they experience. PLPs do not replace that. PLPs do not have a large number of accommodations in them. They don't necessarily speak about the services that students receive. What they do talk about, though, are the pathways that students will gain access and participate in their educational program. And so as we think about more pathways being available to students, and that means all students, you actually may see fewer accommodations necessary to access a pathway that is more personalized to a student through the general education setting. That's not to say that there won't be accommodations necessary for students to access their educational program, but as we work towards a more universally designed learning environment, increase in differentiation, and multiple pathways, there may be accommodations that are built into the school that typically we might have seen sort of just show up in IEPs specific to an individual student. Remember that what is accessible to students without accommodation or service does not need to go in an IEP, and so some of this may be in the PLP and not in the IEP. It's very difficult to draw a specific line for you through a webinar environment like this because it's important that every IEP and every PLP be specific to the individual student. And so the questions that we ask are what's critical. So thinking about where is a specialized accommodation or service necessary for accessing in the way that other students access given disability, that would go into an IEP. But where a student, even though they may have an IEP and they may have a disability or a 504 plan, and I'm going to talk about 504 in just a moment, where they can access that without accommodation and without service, and they can access it just as other students do, that wouldn't go in the IEP, but you now have a place to document that in the PLP, thinking about what's really critical for the student, even though they access as non-disabled peers do, how is it that their pathway is individualized to them through their PLP. So that is the way I would generally describe the interaction of PLPs and IEPs at this point. But what I would also say to you is that this interaction has not had a lot of testing. There haven't been a lot of, there's not a lot of case law on this. There's not a lot of experience yet for practitioners or families in working through this. And I would expect that there will be more questions that will come out of the process as we implement. Schools need to make sure that we're clear about when a student needs something in their IEP versus when it goes into the PLP. And again, that dividing line that I would recommend as we start to think about that really is about whether or not the pathway that a student is taking can be accessed without specialized accommodation and services, or whether they're able to access it without those. And where you can access them without it, then it would belong in the PLP. At this point, what I would like to recommend is that anyone who has specific questions about PLPs and IEPs and how they work, go ahead and put that into the chat box, not the chat box, sorry, the questions box, so that I can see that. I have just described what is the difference between PLPs and IEPs and how they intersect. And given that that is a critical outcome of this webinar, it's very important that I understand how you've understood that and whether or not you've understood that. So I'm just going to give you a brief moment to give me any questions about this particular topic. So I have a question here in reference to the worry that people may experience associated with IEPs reducing in accommodation or services or even going away, and that PLPs will take their place, and that there can be confusion about that. And I agree with that concept strongly, because I think that that will actually be the most important aspect of implementation as we think about PLPs and special education. So let me talk a little bit more about that. Students who have disabilities and are eligible for special education have an entitlement to a free, appropriate public education given the need for services, related services, and accommodations in order to have educational benefit. And that's not going anywhere. The school itself continues to exist with the options that it has, and those options will grow and expand. Whatever a student needs due to disability to access and benefit from the general education options will still need to go into the IEP. The PLP will not replace that. The PLP will identify what pathways the student will take, but just because it does that doesn't mean that the student doesn't need specialized instruction, related services, or accommodations in order to access that pathway. If a student does not need services or accommodations to access the pathway that they've selected, then that would mean that they wouldn't need a component of their IEP to access that pathway. And so that would mean that there might be some things in a PLP that they're accessing. I can think, for example, of a student with a significant learning disability that doesn't impact their gross motor skills, and as they access PE and think about their leisure time and their personal health and development, that they may not need specialized instruction in order to develop a PLP component around their health, wellness, and access to physical education, and making sure that they have a pathway that is personalized to them and that they're engaged in and that's rigorous for them in reference to that particular proficiency that they need to show in order to graduate high school. So that's a place where you might see a PLP identify an area of goal and plan for a student that you wouldn't see in the IEP. But where you see a student who's experiencing a significant impact, let's say, for example, from dyslexia, and it's really creating a significant learning disability under IDEA, and we are talking about performing at grade level and the proficiencies in an English class at the high school level, then we might see a need for both of those pieces to show up both in the PLP as well as in the IEP, where we might see this is the pathway towards our proficiencies in the area of English language arts for that student to graduate, and in order to go forward with that pathway that's identified in their PLP, they will need these services, accommodations, and supports, and that belongs in the IEP because it's necessary for a FAPE. And so that is another example of where you might see something that shows up in both the IEP and in the PLP. And then you might also see something specific to a student that just goes in the IEP that doesn't need to show up in the PLP because it's not part of a pathway towards proficiency, but is something that a student needs in order to make sure that a FAPE is provided. So you can see something in a PLP that isn't in an IEP. You can see something in a PLP that is in an IEP, and you can also see something in an IEP that's not in a PLP. And again, the process by which we walk through this, people will need experience in this and conversation about it and training about it, but hopefully that's a helpful description in reference to how you might experience IEPs and PLPs and the interrelationship between them, because again, they never replace each other. They might have similar content in different ways because they have different purposes. The PLP has one purpose, the IEP has another. So I hope that's helpful. I'm just going to take one moment and read a few of these other questions to make sure I address the questions. Okay, so there's a question about learning anytime, anywhere, which is a saying that has been well grounded in the Act 77 conversations. This is really about getting out of our Carnegie units and moving into proficiencies. Developing interrelationship between our communities and our schools and our work settings in our schools and our post-secondary education institutions and our schools, and really starts to get us thinking about how is it that we get out of the school walls and into a more community-based set of experiences for students and experiential learning. That will look different depending on where the school is in that process. It also looks different depending on where the school is located. So as you think about a school that is in the middle of Burlington, that will look different than a school maybe that is in a more rural area of Vermont because of the access to community resources. The idea that we will get to a place where learning anytime, anywhere for anyone is always true at all times. We're not at that place yet. It is a goal, and I think we will experience more and more of that over time as educational institutions become more creative, both in reference to public schools as well as the community access points. There's also a question about the amount of time it takes to create PLPs, and a concern that teachers have a lot going on, which is also an important conversation to be having. That goes back to the structures and relationships that we develop in order to help students develop their PLPs. Remember that teachers don't write PLPs, students write PLPs, and we need to think about what supports and new learning they need to get, they need to experience in order to write those PLPs, but the process of teachers and how that happens needs to be considerate of what teachers' responsibilities are, where they're doing which bodies of work, when that will happen, and time. Time is always a conversation in the educational environment. There's only so much of it, and so that is really an important thing to think about. And there's not one answer for that. It really depends on the structures of the public school that you're talking about, and so school leaders and teachers need to come together and creatively discuss how is it that we will do this? How will it be most meaningful to the students in our schools? I'm going to move on into transition planning because I think that's an important component of the PLP and the IEP and where you'll see most of the overlap. So both documents consider student goals and both documents help to develop plans towards those goals. There may be transition services that you see in an IEP that you don't see in a PLP, and that may be specific to the student's disability versus access to a more fully accessible for all students pathway towards those secondary goals. So where a service is only available to students who are eligible for special education and requiring that as part of their transition plan, you will see that show up in the IEP. It may also become a component of the PLP, and that's okay, but where the general education experiences and opportunities are accessible to students with disabilities, and that is what they will experience for purposes of meeting their PLP goals, you may not see that in a transition plan. So again, it's the school's job and the parents' job, the team's job to figure out what goes into the IEP, because this is really specifically about access and FAPE in reference to post-secondary planning that is necessary under the IEP versus a general access framework of a PLP. So 504 plans and PLPs need to work together similarly, except that 504 plans do not contain goals. And so where you think about 504's interaction with PLPs, both plans are designed to support a student's access to reach educational goals, but the 504 plan actually doesn't contain the goals. The PLP contains goals, and so that is where the goals will be, is within a PLP. PLPs do not replace 504 plans, and the necessary accommodations that students require or services that students require under a 504 plan in order to access the opportunities that exist for all students given the disability should continue to show up in the 504 plan. And sort of the same logic applies, right? If an opportunity does not require accommodation for access, it is not accommodated through a 504 plan. But if accommodations are necessary to provide equitable access to that opportunity, then the 504 plan should include those accommodations. PLPs are not for purposes of accommodation. They are for purposes of identifying a learning plan through flexible pathways, through the proficiency-based graduation requirements that I discussed earlier. So again, that logic sort of continues on. And then for EST plans, EST, the Educational Support Team plans, vary in structure by school. Again, they're not in replacement of, and in a similar way that 504 plans support accommodations and provide supports necessary for success, the EST plans continue to be needed in order to describe what it is that we will have students have access to in reference to accommodations and supports in order to move forward with that personalized learning plan that exists for the student. EST plans and PLPs are related similarly as PLPs and IEPs and PLPs and 504 plans. So you can really feel the difference in a personalized learning plan through opportunity and how to get toward those graduation requirements through flexible pathways, as opposed to the plans that identify what accommodations, supports, and services are necessary to provide access given either disability or at-risk status for a student through either an IEP, a 504, or an EST plan. So we have about 2 more minutes on this presentation, and I wanted to make sure to give you an opportunity to see if there were any more questions that I haven't answered so far. So I'll just give you a moment, and if there's any lingering questions that you have, given the presentation information that I've provided, please go ahead and type that in. All right. I'm not seeing any further questions, so feel free to think about it and type another one in if you have one, and I can always go back. I did want to share with you a list of resources that I have put together here. Most of these are shared from the Agency of Education and their trainings in reference to PLPs. There is an entire website dedicated to PLPs at the Agency of Education, and while it's not specific to special education, 504, and EST, it really helps you understand where schools are in reference to implementation. It will give you an opportunity to dive deeper into Act 77, which is also linked here in reference to the flexible pathways. Education quality standards are the standards that are governed by the state board that schools are held accountable to, and all of this is included there. There is also a crosswalk of PLPs, IEPs, 504, and ESTs linked there that you can use, and then frequently asked questions between IEPs, PLPs, and proficiency-based graduation requirements. There are a number of other states, as I had shared, that are moving forward with PLPs, and so this is the New Jersey Guide for Implementing Personalized Student Learning Plans, just so that you have access to a national resource or another state resource. And then there's also supporting every student's transition to college and career through student learning plans. That's a great resource. There's a proficiency-based resource, and then there's Students at the Center Hub, which is worth reviewing if you're interested. So that is the end of the presentation. I would like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I would encourage you to visit the VFN website at vermontfamilynetwork.org for helpful resources, more upcoming webinars, and other workshops and events. This webinar specifically will be archived along with all of the other webinars that VFN provides and can be viewed on the Vermont Family Network's YouTube channel. If you would like to talk to someone at VFN, don't hesitate to call 1-800-800-4005, and thank you for having me today. I hope you have a wonderful day.